This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Foundations, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my limited set review for Foundations. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, white, blue, and black cards, and now we're looking at red. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what those grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, I'm only talking about draft and sealed, and that means I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Only the cards with set numbers between 1 and 271 are in play boosters, so keep that in mind. Play boosters in this set do also have the incredibly rare special guests, and I'll cover those in their own video after getting through the main set. Also worth remembering, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, so they're more like projections, although this set has a lot more reprints than normal, so I have actually played with a bunch of cards in the set. Either way, as the format comes into focus, I'll do videos where I discuss how things have actually turned out. I also want to remind you that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the red cards in Foundations. First, it's Battle Song Berserker, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 human berserker at uncommon. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. So this will impact the board the turn it comes down, almost always allowing you to take an attack you didn't have before. This is a trigger that doesn't care what creature attacks. However you attack, however many things you attack with, you get this trigger. And of course, Battle Song Berserker can also target itself, meaning at worst it can attack as a 4/4 menace. But it's significantly better than that because usually, like I said, the turn it comes down, it will buff something and give you an attack you didn't have before. This looks pretty good to me. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Bolt Wave, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon sorcery. It deals 3 damage to each opponent. So, as good as this is going to be in 60 card format burn decks, you can't really play a card that does nothing but 3 damage to your opponent in limited. Casting this is card disadvantage in a big way. This format does have lots of spell payoffs, which probably keep it from being a full-on F, but it's still not good. It's a D-. You just can't play cards that don't impact the board. Casting this will effectively be like mulliganing, and that's not where you want to be. Next up, it's Bulk Up, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. Double target creature's power until end of turn, and it has flashback for 4 generic and 2 red, which means you can cast it from your graveyard for that cost, and then exile it. This only doubles power, so it doesn't usually allow your creature to survive a combat it couldn't survive already, and that's always a big problem for combat tricks. It does give you the chance to do tons of damage to an opponent out of nowhere, and on a Trampler or First Striker it gets spicy, and if you have 8 mana available you can cast it twice and buff one thing all in the same turn. But that's a lot of mana, you're not going to pull that off in limited very often, and this just seems like too narrow of a card to be a card that always makes the cut or anything like that, giving it a D. Next up, it's Chandra Flame Shaper, which for 5 generic and 2 red is a 6 loyalty legendary planeswalker Chandra at Mythic Rare. She's got a +2 that gives you 3 red mana, then you exile the top 3 cards of your library and choose one, and you can play that card this turn. She's got a +1 that creates a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it has haste, and at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice this token. And she's got a -4 that has her do 8 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers. 7 mana is a lot, but this feels like a 7 mana planeswalker. Her most impactful ability most of the time when she comes down that late is going to be that -4. You would spend 7 mana on a card that just had that effect, because it can end up decimating your opponent's board or taking down 2 big creatures. It's an ability that will always reshape the board in a big way. But then she sticks around and draws you cards effectively with her +2, and if you already have a good creature on the board, you might just use her +1 so you can send an additional copy of it in. Same is true if that creature has an enters trigger. She's going to have massive impacts on games, and usually just going to be able to take the game over after using her -4, and then going back to her other abilities. She's a bomb, I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Courageous Goblin, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 goblin at common. When it attacks while you control a creature with power 4 or greater, this creature gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. If you're consistently attacking with this as a 3-2 menace on like turn 3, it's going to feel pretty good, and there are some lower curve 4-power creatures that can make that happen, especially in red-green. It looks like a decent 2-drop that will be a better attacker a decent chunk of the time, giving it a C. Next up, it's Crackling Cyclops, which for 2 generic and a red is a 0/4 Cyclops Wizard at common. Whenever you cast an on-creature spell, it gets +3/+0 until end of turn. Don't love this. If you can't cast a non-creature spell, well, it's a 0/4, and while you can threaten to grow it at instant speed sometimes, I just feel it will be a 0/4 way too often for it to be anything special, and I mean, sometimes you can trigger it multiple times, and that's when things get kind of interesting, and that's what keeps it from being an F, but I do think it's a D. Next up, it's Dragon Trainer, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 1/1 human at uncommon, and when it enters, you create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. This is a really good deal for 5 mana. A 4/4 dragon is a threat on most boards, and if you can find ways to recur or blink the trainer, things can get really silly, and there are certainly ways to do that. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Electro Duplicate, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it has haste, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice this token, and it has flashback for 2 generic and 2 red. So, this token you make needs to generate some real value for this to be worth it. Just making a temporary extra copy of a random 3/3 isn't going to feel good, but the good news is it's not that hard to achieve that in today's Limited. There are enough death, enters, and attack triggers in the format for this to do stuff with them. And sometimes you can copy something huge, which also makes the effect worth it. Mix in flashback, and I do think you generate at least a card of value with this most of the time, and sometimes you'll get a lot more than that, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Fiery Annihilation, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant that does 5 damage to target creature. Exile up to 1 target equipment attached to that creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. 3 mana to do 5 at instant speed is premium removal that can often trade up, and exiling the target really matters with all the death triggers we see these days. The equipment upside is less likely to come up, but there is a decent amount of equipment in the format, and when you do pull it off, it's going to be a nasty 2-for-1. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Goblin Borders, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 Goblin Pirate at common, and it has Raid, which means if you attacked this turn, something good happens. In this case, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. So if this was a 3 mana 4/3 100% of the time, it would be a C+ at the very best. And even that might be pushing it a bit, and this won't always be able to enter with that counter. If you're curving out with raid stuff, it's a fine 3-drop, but there are going to be enough times where it's just a 3 mana 3/2 that I have a hard time going above a C- here. Next up, it's Goblin Negotiation, which for X and 2 red is an uncommon sorcery. It deals X damage to target creature, and you create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to the amount of excess damage dealt to that creature this way. As a removal spell, this is never going to feel great. I mean, 4 mana to do 2 damage to something isn't really where you want to be, especially with a sorcery, but this does scale in a big way as the game goes on, and once you're getting some goblins out of the deal, it feels plenty efficient. And if you need to, you can run it out early to kill something. Even though that won't feel great, this basically has a passable early game mode, and then it can just win the game late. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Gorehorn Raider, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/4 Minotaur Pirate at common with Raid. When it enters, you do 2 damage to any target. If this always did 2 when it entered, it would be a B-. That's a creature with a sizable body that can remove something, and it's hard to say no to that. But it's going to feel awful when it's just a 5 mana 4/4, so I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Incinerating Blast, which for 4 generic and a red is a common sorcery that deals 6 damage to target creature, and you can discard a card, and if you do, you draw a card. 5 mana to deal 6 at sorcery speed is not very good. That's like a C-. Sure, it kills most stuff, but you're rarely going to feel like you're doing something efficient, and you frequently have to point it at like a 3/3, and then it feels truly miserable. Mixing in the rummage effect makes a difference, but I think it just gets it up to a C. Next up, it's Kellen, Planar Trailblazer, which for 1 red mana is a 2/1 Human Fairy Scout at rare. It's also legendary. And you can pay 1 generic and a red, and if Kellen is a scout, it becomes a Human Fairy Detective and gains. Whenever Kellen deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. And you can pay 2 generic and a red, and if Kellen is a detective, it becomes a 3/2 Human Fairy Rogue, and it gains double strike. If you play it on turn 1, it's going to feel pretty good, like most 1 mana 2/1s do, and then it has awesome upside the longer the game goes. I mean, This isn't quite as busted as Ragavan, but it does kind of give you a good impression, since once you sink mana into it, it can start to draw you cards, and then later you can make it a 3/2 double striker, and that's a body that's relevant all game long, especially because if your opponent lets it through, you effectively get to draw 2 cards. The efficiency here is out of this world, and I think it's enough to give it an A-. Next up, it's Rite of the Dragon Caller, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare enchantment. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. This doesn't do anything on its own, and that's a big problem. It's one of those enchantments that you have to cross your fingers for so that you make it to your next turn. And then, in this case, you also need to have an instant or a sorcery, which also isn't guaranteed. For most red decks in the format, this is just an F, because you don't have the luxury of spending this much mana not to impact the board, and you don't have enough instants and sorceries. But I do think it's a B-level build-around for spell decks which can more consistently get the dragons once they do untap, but it is harder to go higher than a B since it doesn't do anything at first. Next up, it's Seer Slicer Goblin, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Goblin Warrior. At rare, it has Raid. At the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token. So if you played a 1-drop, attack with that 1-drop, and then play this on turn 2, your opponent's going to feel like the game is over, since you've added an insane amount to the board in your first 2 turns. And once you get that first Goblin, you kind of have access to a free one every turn, since you can at least just send that Goblin token in. It is true that if you get this late and you're not ahead, it'll feel rough, but even on most board states that are at parity, you have an attack you can make, and adding 2 bodies to the board is good even in those situations. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Slumbering Cerberus, which for 1 generic and a red is a 4/2 dog at uncommon. It doesn't untap during your untap step, and it has Morbid, which means if a creature died this turn, something happens. In this case, it untaps during your end step. A 2-mana 4/2 is a nice deal, especially in a set that has 4 power or more payoffs. This is one of the cheapest ways you can get those going, but this is going to end up unable to untap a lot of the time. I mean, combat is most frequently the way to make something die, but your opponent probably kills this in combat if that's the situation. This can trade up for 4 or even 5 drops, even if you never attack with it, and when you can attack with it effectively, it does hit pretty hard, giving it a C. Next up, it's Sower of Chaos, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 devil at common. You can pay 2 generic and a red, and target creature can't block this turn. This has a mediocre stat line, and the activated ability is super expensive, to the point that you can't really have the time to use it until the extreme late game. At that stage, it can sometimes make a difference, but it still costs so much mana that there will be plenty of situations where shutting down 1 or 2 blockers doesn't make a real difference, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Strongbox Raider, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 5/2 Orc Pirate at uncommon with Raid. When it enters, exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. Because this Raid trigger gives you a card, it does make it less painful to make a dangerous attack, and it will make any trade you offer feel pretty good. Problem is, you just won't always be able to raid, and when you can't, a 4-mana 5/2 is just a card you can't be playing, even in a format with some high power payoffs. If this always did its enters trigger, it would be like a B, but I don't think you'll be able to get it often enough for it to be more than a C. Next up, it's Twin Flame Tyrant, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 3/5 dragon at mythic rare. It's got flying, and if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent opponent controls, it deals double that damage instead. This augments your board immediately, making all of your attacks way better, no matter what they do damage to. It effectively doubles the power of all of your creatures, and that's going to turn a game around in a big way. Suddenly your 2/2s are attacking as 4/2s, and your 3/3s are attacking as 6/3s, and those are bodies that are a huge problem. And of course, it can just smash in for 6 at a time on its own. It's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Alright, let's move into the red reprints, starting with Abrade, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Abrade deals 3 damage to target creature or destroy target artifact. This is nice every time we see it. 2 mana to do 3 damage is always premium because it's so easy to trade up, and this throws in the ability to take out problematic artifacts on occasion, giving it a B. Next up, it's Axeguard Cavalry, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Dwarf Berserker at common, and you can tap it to give target creature haste until end of turn. This card wasn't very good in Kaldheim, and we saw a similar card more recently in Bloomburrow that was also bad. That might sound strange after all this is a 2 mana 2/2 with upside, right? And that's true, but the bad cards today don't look as bad as the bad cards of old because they don't just print cards, especially at common, that do nothing or actively hurt you very often anymore. So a 2-mana 2/2 with only a very small upside is substantially worse than most other 2-drops will be. Tapping one creature to give another haste is just not very good. In red decks, you usually want your 2-drops to attack after all, and haste is of course a keyword that's only relevant for a turn, so unless you play a creature during your turn, this ability is irrelevant. It's not an F because it's not a complete disaster. If you need a 2-drop, you'll play it, but it's a D. Next up, it's Brass's Bounty, which for 6 generic and a red is a rare sorcery. For each land you control, create a treasure token. In Limited, you never have anything to do with all the mana this card creates, and that is all it does, is make a bunch of mana. If you've got 7 mana already in Limited, you're probably set, so it's an F. Next up, it's Brazen Scourge, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 gremlin at uncommon, and it has haste. If this didn't cost double red, it'd probably be a B-, since it's just a great 3-drop that can quickly pressure opponents, but the double red makes it a lot harder to do that on turn 3, so it's probably a C+. Next up, it's Burst Lightning, which for 1 red mana is a common instant with Kicker for 4 generic, which means you can pay that additional cost as you cast it. It does 2 damage to any target, and if it was kicked, it deals 4 damage instead. Shock is already a really good card in Limited, since you can pay 1 mana and deal with a wide swath of creatures, including many that cost more than 1 mana, so this having Kicker always makes it even more amazing. You don't get a great deal when you kick it, of course, but its upside on Shock, that means you can use it to take down bigger stuff late. This format has a spell deck too, likely making it even better. It's a B. Next up, it's Drakuseth Mauve Flames, which for 4 generic and 3 red is a 7/7 legendary dragon. At rare, it's got flying, and when it attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to each of up to 2 other targets. So if you get to attack with this, you're probably going to win the game since it hits hard and can kill up to 3 things. Problem is, triple red is far from guaranteed when you have 7 lands in play, and it is vulnerable for a whole turn, during which your opponent has a window to get some back-breaking tempo. Drakuseth felt like a B- last time, and I think that's the case here too. You just have to account for the times where you just can't play it. Next up, it's Atali Primal Storm, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/6 legendary Elder Dinosaur. At rare. When it attacks, you exile the top card of each player's library, then you may cast any number of spells from among those cards without paying their mana costs. This isn't as insane and Limited as you might think, mostly because it's a 6 mana 6/6 that does nothing up front. Once you do attack though, you can potentially get 2 free spells. It's more common to get 1, and sometimes you do get 0, and most of the time the 6/6 will go down in combat, so the times you get 0 can feel particularly brutal. Now all that said, it's still a bomb. It'll usually deliver at least a 2 for 1, and frequently more than that, but its limitations keep it to an A-. Next up, it's Fanatical Firebrand, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Pirate at common with haste. You can tap it and sacrifice it to have it do 1 damage to any target. The Firebrand feels nice on turn 1, and its activated ability helps it remain relevant all game long, since it can kill X1s and even ping your opponent, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Firebrand Archer, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 human archer at common. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is a solid payoff if you're in a spell deck, and can be particularly spicy in multiples, but it probably needs a build-around grade, because if you're a typical red deck with like 5 ways to trigger this, it's a D. If you're a spell deck with a critical mass of non-creature spells, it's more like a C. Next up, it's Fire Spitter Whelp, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature or dragon spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. This has a very similar trigger to the Firebrand Archer, but it also counts dragons. Not that that counts in a big way, but it is technically better. And it's also a better creature in general, because a 3 mana 2/2 flyer is usually going to be better than a 2 mana 2/1, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Flamewake Phoenix, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 2/2 Phoenix. At rare, it has flying and haste, attacks each combat if able, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you can pay 1 red, and if you do, you return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. A 3 mana 2/2 with flying and haste is already pretty nice, even if it does always have to attack, and getting it back for a single red in the late game is pretty great, and the red-green deck really looks like it can pull that off. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Frenzied Goblin, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Berserker at uncommon. Whenever it attacks, you can pay a red, and if you do, target creature can't block this turn. This is a pretty nice 1-drop. In the mid to late game, you often have a random red mana around to really allow you to have an effective attack that you didn't have before, and your opponent has to account for that, giving it a C. Next up, it's Goblin Surprise, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. Choose one. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn, or create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. If this always made 2 tokens, it'd be like a C-, and if it was always a Trumpet Blast, it'd be like a build around C-. But this can do both. If you need more bodies, it gives them to you, and if you've already gone wide enough that the +2/+0 effect is good, well, you can just use it instead. It's still not an insane card. After all, the token option is a bit underpowered, and the +2/+0 option is very narrow, but I think it's a C overall. Next up, it's Heartfire Immolator, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon, and it has prowess, and you can pay 1 red and sacrifice it, and it deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker. This is a nice card. I mean, you'd play a 2-mana 2/2 with prowess 100% of the time, and you'd play a 2-mana 2/2 that can give itself up to do damage to a creature, too. And this is both, and the 2 abilities work well together, too. It's a scary creature to see on turn 2, since you can just untap, play a land, and attack with all kinds of possibilities, and while it does become less relevant late, you can just turn it into removal. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Hidetsugu's Second Right, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. If target player has exactly 10 life, Hidetsugu's Second Right deals 10 damage to that player. This is a fun card to include for new players because it shows you some of the weirdness that's in Magic, but obviously it's a horrible card, especially in Limited. It's insanely narrow. You're just not going to get your opponent to exactly 10 in most games when you also happen to have this in your hand, and it's effectively a blank card most of the time. It's an F. Next up, it's Involuntary Employment, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn, create a treasure token. This format does not have a dedicated sacrifice deck, and that's where this kind of card can really shine because you can sacrifice the creature you steal. That said, there are certainly very cheap sacrifice effects, especially in black, so I think there will still be black-red decks that can do powerful stuff with this. They just won't come together as often as they would if there was a straight-up black-red sacrifice deck. You can't really play this in other decks and expect it to be good since it only tends to be worthwhile. Otherwise, when it straight up ends the game, and that's just too narrow. It's a D in regular aggro decks and a C in a deck with some sacrifice outlets. Next up, it's Krenko Mob Boss, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 legendary goblin warrior. At rare, you can tap it to create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins you control. So there's not an insane amount of goblin stuff in this set, but as we've seen, there are goblins in it, and even on his own, Krenko makes 1 token, and he makes more and more from there. The downside is the Hill Giant stat line, but it's worth the risk. Krenko will take over games where he's left unchecked, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Seismic Rupture, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It deals 2 damage to each creature without flying. This is hard to consistently take advantage of in Limited, since you have little control over whether you or your opponents suffer more when you cast it. Now, if you've got tons of flyers and ground creatures with 3 or more toughness, it can be good, but that's not a deck that just comes together in red. If you're in a controlling deck, it's a decent sideboard card, but it's a D in your main deck and a C out of the sideboard. Next up, it's Shivan Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 5/5 dragon at uncommon with flying, and you can pay 1 red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. How the mighty have fallen. I talked about Serra Angel earlier in the week and how it's dropped off a ton from Magic's early days, but Shivan Dragon has fallen even farther. 6 mana is a ton for a creature with no enter or death trigger or effect that adds to the board in a meaningful way up front. If it doesn't die, it can take over games to an extent thanks to its evasiveness and fire breathing, but it's just so clunky by today's standards that it's just a C. Next up, it's Slagstorm, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. Choose one. Slagstorm deals 3 damage to each creature, or it deals 3 damage to each player. This can be powerful in the right situation, like when it annihilates your opponent's board and doesn't hurt yours too much. Problem is, setting up those boards in Limited is very hard. If you're a control deck, this could be good, but the number of Limited decks in red that are legitimate control decks that can make this one-sided is really, really low. It is nice, you can bolt both players if you don't want the other mode. That does make it a little more interesting to be sure, but overall this is just really hard to use effectively in Limited. It's a D in your main deck most of the time, but if you end up in a red control deck, it's more like a C. Next up, it's Spitfire Lagak, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 lizard at common, and it has landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, this deals 1 damage to each opponent. This wasn't very good when we saw it originally, and I don't imagine it'll be anything special here. The stat line is almost passable, and the landfall trigger is nice, but ultimately pretty underwhelming. It's a C-. Next up, it's Sure Strike, which for one generic and a red is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. This is great at helping creatures win combat. It'll do that almost every single time, but it doesn't do anything against removal, and that makes it pretty narrow. These days, the good combat tricks are good against both things, especially when they cost 2 or more. If you're a red aggro deck, you'll probably play one, and it does get a little more interesting if you have some prowess creatures, but it's probably a C-. Next up, it's Thrill of Possibility, which for one generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, discard a card, draw 2 cards. This is always fine. It gives you some nice card selection and does it at instant speed, and it does get substantially better in a format with prowess because it can enable you to get multiple triggers in a turn. It's still nothing special, but you will be casting this in the format, and a lot of red decks will run one of them, giving it a C. Right, that is our last red card from Foundations. In the next video, I'll be looking at all the green cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to make sure you stay aware of the rest of the set review as well as other videos about this format, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.